The dress was ivory, floor-length, and so far out of my reach it might as well have hung on the moon. I know that sounds like the beginning of a fairy tale, and in a way I suppose it is, but not the kind where the magic is handed to you by someone else, the kind where the magic was always yours, and the whole story is simply the world catching up to that fact. I remember standing in the center of that boutique, Marshaline's, the kind of place where the carpet costs more than my annual rent, and the chandeliers are not decorations but declarations, and the staff smile at you the way they smile at a child who has wandered into the wrong classroom, with patience and a very faint condescension that is somehow worse than open hostility, because open hostility at least acknowledges you as an equal threat. And I remember the exact moment I understood what kind of story I was in. The kind where the girl in the sensible flats and the off-brand coat is not the heroine. Not here. Not according to them. Not according to the particular geometry of this room, which had been designed, down to the angle of every mirror and the height of every plinth, to make certain kinds of women feel inevitable and other kinds of women feel like errors of navigation, like something that has taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere it was never meant to arrive. The air inside Marshaline's smelled of white peonies and old money, and something else beneath both of those, a kind of composite confidence, the scent of a place that has never had to question its own importance and does not intend to start. The sales consultant's name was Giselle. She had cheekbones that looked engineered and eyes that had already dismissed me before I had opened my mouth, eyes that performed a single rapid inventory. My coat, my shoes, my handbag, the slight tiredness around my eyes that comes from a 12-hour ward shift 2 days prior, and arrived at a conclusion that she then acted upon for the entirety of the hour that followed. She held the gown at arm's length as though presenting evidence at a trial. "This," she said, her voice honeyed with contempt in that particular way that very practiced contempt always sounds like honey, smooth and sweet and slightly medicinal, is a 240,000 piece. Custom atelier. 12 months lead time. She tilted her head. The tilt of someone who has performed this particular theatre many times and knows exactly where the beats land and how much silence to leave between them. Perhaps we have something in the sample sale room that would be more, and she let the pause do her cruelty for her, let it hang in the air of that perfumed room like something expensive left to breathe, appropriate. And my friends, the women I had trusted, the women who had insisted I come here, who had dangled this afternoon of bridal fantasy like a gift wrapped with their very best ribbon, who had said things like, "You deserve this, and it will be so fun, and I know the woman at the door, we will be taken care of." They laughed, not loudly, socially. The kind of laugh that is a choice dressed up as a reflex, the kind that says, "I am on the correct side of this moment, and I have decided which side that is, and I am going to make sure everyone in this room understands which side I have chosen." I want you to hold that image for a moment before I go any further. A woman standing in a room in which she does not belong, according to everyone in it, surrounded by the people she trusted most in the world, listening to laughter she was never meant to join. I want you to feel the specific weight of that, because I felt it. I felt every gram of it. And then I want you to know this. In 37 minutes, the ground beneath every person in that room was going to shake. What they did not know, what none of them could have known because I did not know it myself, not the full truth of it, was that the man waiting for me outside, the quiet man, the kind man, the one they had whispered was perhaps a little beneath me, because he drove a modest car and wore a worn watch and never discussed his family in the elaborate coded way that people who want you to know about their family always find occasion to discuss their family, was about to walk through those glass doors and unmake their entire world, methodically, completely, without raising his voice once. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it begins, because you need to feel what I felt in that room to understand what the reversal means. You need to carry the weight of the fall to understand the height of the recovery. The vindication is nothing without the humiliation that precedes it. I owe you both. His name was Daniel. I met him on a Tuesday in October, the specific kind of October that smells like wet pavement and wood smoke, and the particular bittersweet melancholy of a year beginning to close its accounts, the kind of evening that makes you feel both very small and quietly glad to be alive in the same breath. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the pediatric ward. I was a pediatric nurse, not because it paid well, which it did not nearly well enough for the kind of work it actually was, not for the emotional arithmetic of a day spent moving between the bedsides of children and their terrified, exhausted, desperately hopeful parents, not for the weight of being in that room when the news was bad, which it sometimes was, but because it was the only work that made me feel like I was spending my hours correctly. Like the direction I was pointing mattered, like I was pointing toward something. I was standing under the narrow awning of a coffee cart on the corner near the hospital entrance, rain collecting in the collar of my coat in that particular way that manages to feel both cold and warm at once, fumbling with coins I could not quite count because my hands were still carrying the chill of the ward, and he simply appeared beside me. There was no dramatic entrance, no announcement, no clearing of a throat. He was just suddenly there, very quiet and very still, with a small patient smile. And he said, without ceremony and without drama, allow me. He did not make a production of it. He did not reach across me with theatrical gallantry or say anything that required a response beyond receiving what was offered. He simply paid for my coffee and stood with me under the awning while the rain decided what it wanted to do, looking out at the wet street with the easy contentment of someone who is not waiting for something better to happen, who has arrived at a relationship with the present moment that requires no improvement. We talked for 23 minutes. I know because I checked the time afterward, standing at the bus stop in the rain with the coffee growing warm in my hands, trying to reconstruct the conversation and finding that it was somehow both very ordinary and impossible to fully account for. We talked about nothing important and about everything. He told me he worked in what he called family investment management, a description so modest and so vague that it had the quality of something constructed rather than arrived at, chosen rather than disclosed, and I filed it away without pressing because there was something in the way he said it that suggested the vagueness was intentional, and the intention was consideration rather than concealment. He wanted to be known by other things first. He had a stillness to him that I had never encountered in another person before that evening, not the stillness of someone hiding something, and not the stillness of someone who has simply stopped trying to be interesting. It was the stillness of someone who has nothing left to prove to anyone in any room, who has arrived at a relationship with his own existence that requires no external confirmation, and I would not understand for a very long time whether that stillness came from complete inner peace or from immense and long-settled power. It turned out to be both, which are, I have since learned, more often the same thing than the world tends to acknowledge. He walked me to the bus stop without asking whether I wanted the company. He simply walked beside me, holding a small umbrella at a height that sheltered us both equally. And when the bus appeared at the far end of the street, he reached into his jacket and produced a card, printed on paper so thick and cream-colored it felt like holding a small piece of architecture, with only his name and a single phone number and nothing else. No title, no company, no list of credentials. Just Daniel, as though that were sufficient information. Which it was. I called him 3 days later, telling myself it was casual curiosity and the decent thing to do. It was not casual, and it was not merely decent. By December he had become the axis around which my days quietly organized themselves, the person I reached toward when something happened, good or terrible or simply interesting, that I wanted to share with someone who would listen in the particular way he listened, which was completely without preparing his response while I was still speaking. He never spent money in ways designed to be observed. He took me to small restaurants with handwritten menus and wine lists that arrived on single-folded cards. He brought flowers from a market stall, never a florist, because the market stall ones had been chosen that morning by a person who had actually looked at them, and that seemed to him the better provenance. He wore a watch, always the same watch, a plain-faced thing with a worn leather strap that had developed over what I would learn was several decades of consistent daily wear, the particular softness of something that has been genuinely cared for, which is a different and more valuable softness than the softness of something simply new, that I later discovered carried a lineage so specific and so significant that 3 separate experts in horology, when I eventually described it to them, became very quiet in the particular way of people who have just understood something that changes the nature of the conversation. When I asked about his family, which I did gently and only a handful of times in those early months, he would offer a particular smile, patient, warm, carrying something complicated just beneath its surface, and say, "They are a great deal. You will understand eventually." I did not push. I trusted the smile, and I trusted the patience behind it. The ring deserves its own paragraph. He proposed in March, in the rain, because of course it was raining, because rain had become by then our private language, the element in which every significant thing between us had already happened and would continue to happen, as though the weather itself had decided to be consistent about us. The ring was not showy. A single stone, pale as the particular light that comes just before winter gives up, ancient-looking in a way that suggested it had existed for a very long time before the setting that currently held it, set in a band of such unusual composition that when I later showed it to a jeweler, she held it for a long, still moment before telling me, in the voice of someone revising several assumptions simultaneously, that it was one of perhaps 4 such pieces in documented existence, and asking, with what I recognized as impressive professional restraint, how I had come to be wearing it. He said it had belonged to his grandmother. He said, with the simplicity of absolute sincerity, "She would have loved you the moment she laid eyes on you." His eyes at that moment were saying the thing they had been trying to say for months, the thing his mouth was still only learning the words for. I said yes before the sentence was finished. I would say yes 100 more times in the days and years that followed, in 100 different registers and contexts, and mean it with more force each time. Camille was the one who organized the appointment at Marshaline's, and I want to be deliberate and precise about this because it matters, because the organizing was not an innocent act of friendship, and I think I knew that, somewhere below the level at which I was willing to examine it, even before the day itself. Camille had been my friend since the opening week of university, or what I had believed for 11 years was friendship, the kind that is actually a long-running audit of your relative standing, conducted with warmth and occasional humor, and the kind of targeted observations that are deployed so lightly and so plausibly that you can only recognize them as weapons after enough time has passed to provide perspective. She had become engaged the previous autumn to a man named Marcus, a large and confident property developer who spoke entirely in declarative sentences, had very recently made a considerable amount of money, and had a way of assessing every room he entered and every person in it that was so rapid and so complete that it had become, I suspected, unconscious. Camille had absorbed his world the way a good cloth absorbs water, completely, without resistance, without preserving the shape she had previously held. She wore the right labels now, not ostentatiously but consistently, the way someone wears a uniform not because they have to, but because they have come to believe it represents something true about them. She knew the right restaurants and had opinions about them that arrived with the confidence of authority rather than preference. She had, in the preceding 6 months, begun enunciating her vowels in a slightly different way, a shift so small and so consistent that it could only have been deliberate, a practiced adjustment rather than a natural evolution. "Marshallines is the place," she announced over a lunch she had arranged specifically to discuss my upcoming wedding, at a restaurant she had chosen, and at which I noticed only afterward that the menu presented to me did not include prices while hers did. Not a place. The place. You simply must go. Everyone who is anyone has been. You cannot be taken seriously anywhere else if you have not at least spent an afternoon there. I suggested gently that this might fall outside the parameters of what I was working with financially. Camille waved this away with the brisk efficiency of someone dismissing a minor administrative concern, a footnote, a detail for later consideration. "Don't think about that today," she said. "Today is about the vision, about dreaming." Sophie and Ingrid completed the party. Sophie managed a luxury lifestyle publication and had recently published a long, thoughtful piece about how the genuinely wealthy never name-drop because they have no need to. A piece she had clearly written with conviction, and she name-dropped with impressive frequency and apparent unconsciousness. Ingrid had once been the person I would have called first in any real crisis, the person whose number I reached for before I had finished forming the thought of needing someone, and she had, in the past year, migrated quietly and smoothly into Camille's orbit with the particular deliberateness of someone who has identified the winning side and moved toward it without announcing the movement or acknowledging the calculation. We arrived at Marshallines at 11 in the morning on a Thursday in late spring. The boutique occupied the entire ground floor of a building on a street where every shop window contained a single object and an enormous amount of considered empty space, as if the merchandise required room, required distance, required a certain reverence of approach. The door was held open by a young man in a suit, so precisely fitted it suggested the suit was the point, and he said nothing and communicated everything about what kind of establishment this was and what kind of client it expected. Inside, the air was white flowers and expensive restraint. Giselle materialized from the direction of the fitting rooms with the smooth inevitability of someone who has been watching the entrance and has made her initial assessments before crossing the floor. She assessed me in the time it takes to complete a single blink and made a decision I could see her making. A small, clean, downward calibration, the quiet and permanent closing of a particular door. She greeted Camille with both hands extended and a warmth that had the quality of a business transaction dressed as personal feeling. She greeted me correctly, which is the most damning form of greeting, the greeting that fulfills its technical obligations and withholds everything else. The gowns came out one at a time, each carried reverently on a padded silk hanger by the junior consultant who served as Giselle's second, each presented with the seriousness that properly belongs to surgical instruments or museum objects, each one an argument about what a woman should look like on the most significant day of her life, and what kind of woman deserves to look that way. They were extraordinary. I will not pretend otherwise, because even now, even in full possession of everything that followed, the craft in those gowns was real. I touched the sleeve of a strapless piece in Chantilly lace and felt the hours embedded in it, the individual decisions of the artisans who had worked it, the accumulated technical knowledge of people who had spent their entire professional lives learning to do this one thing with absolute mastery, and the touching of it was its own quiet education. But Giselle had already decided, and a person who has already decided moves through the evidence with remarkable efficiency, selecting what confirms and releasing what does not. When I asked about a particular gown, ivory, architecturally spare, with a structural precision that felt almost mathematical, the kind of dress that does not compete with the person wearing it, but instead holds them, frames them, allows them to exist in full. She produced the smile I had by then learned to recognize as the smile that precedes a closed door and said, That is from our couture collection. It is reserved for established clients. I said, I am a client. I am here as a client at an appointment arranged through your booking system. She said, of course, in a tone that meant precisely its opposite, the kind of agreement that is so thoroughly a form of disagreement that it represents a refinement of the art. Camille said nothing. Camille had, I noticed, become very interested in the hem of the gown on the display mannequin to her left. Her attention focused there with the concentrated deliberateness of someone who has chosen not to see something. Sophie had drifted toward a display of cathedral-length veils near the window, and was examining them with the critical attentiveness of someone who writes about things like this for a living, which she did. Ingrid laughed. Not unkindly, she would almost certainly say if the question were put to her, and this is the cruelest feature of a certain kind of unkindness, that it is designed to be undeniable, and pointed toward the curtained archway at the rear of the boutique, toward a gown hanging there that she suggested I might try. And the archway led to what Giselle had referred to earlier in the tour as the archive room, and which I now understood completely to be the sample room, the back room, the room maintained for a specific category of client, the room for brides of a certain budget attending occasions of a certain scale. I tried the dress because I had not yet assembled, in that particular environment, the self-possession required to stop. The dress did not fit. It was incorrect by 2 full sizes in 3 separate dimensions. Giselle positioned herself nearby with her arms crossed, while the junior consultant applied bulldog clips to the back seam in a performance of alteration that had the quality of theatre rather than craft, and the 3 women who had come with me sat on the ivory upholstered chairs arranged for observers and held their champagne glasses with the ease of people who are exactly where they expected to be, and I stood on the raised circular platform in the center of the room in a dress that hung wrongly from my shoulders and gathered incorrectly at my waist and puddled on the floor in a way that made me look not like a bride, but like someone playing at being one, and the silence in that room was the loudest thing I had experienced in recent memory. Camille tilted her head in the particular way she had been tilting her head since we were 21, and said, "It is actually quite cute." She glanced at Sophie for confirmation. Casual kind of way. Ingrid said, "I am sure your Daniel would think it was sweet. He seems like the type who appreciates simple things." It was the way she said your Daniel, a specific surgical inflection. The inflection of a diminishment so practiced and so embedded in her relationship to the subject that she delivered it without apparent effort or awareness. The inflection of someone who has long since made a determination about where Daniel fits in the hierarchy of things and is simply referencing that determination rather than making it afresh. Giselle produced a clipboard and proposed with efficient professionalism that I might wish to consider the boutique's budget collection, which began at just under 8,000 and was, she said, very appropriate for a more intimate ceremony, very sweet for someone in my... She did not complete the sentence. She did not need to. The phone in my handbag vibrated against my hip like a small, insistent truth. I stepped down from the platform without asking whether I was permitted to do so. It was Daniel's number on the screen. I walked toward the window, the only place in that room that offered anything other than its own interior to look at, and answered the call. "How is the appointment?" he said. His voice was what it always was, warm and quiet and carrying the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who is genuinely asking rather than producing the sounds of asking as a social mechanism. "Fine," I said. "It is lovely here. I am a poor liar to the people I love. This is not something I claim as a virtue. It is simply a feature of how I am made, something that has occasionally cost me comfort and more often been a mercy." There was a pause, not a long pause, a very particular pause, the kind whose quality tells you exactly what the person on the other end has understood, that the pause itself is an answer, that the gap between what I said and what I meant had been detected and was being carefully processed. Then his voice changed. It is not easy to describe the change except to say that I felt it before I understood it. It was not dramatic. There was no shift in volume. It changed the way a sky changes in the precise minutes before serious weather, a variation in pressure so slight that an untrained observer would register nothing, but so perceptible to anything alive and paying attention that every creature in the field feels it in their chest and turns instinctively toward cover. "I see," he said. The two words had a specific gravity. "Stay where you are. I will be there in 15 minutes. "Daniel," I said, "you do not—" "15 minutes," he said. And then the call ended quietly, without drama, the way he did everything. I stood at the window with the phone still in my hand, and I thought about what I knew about this man. 8 months of evidence. I thought about the coffee in the rain, the card with only his name, the market flowers, the small restaurants, the worn watch, the particular smile when I asked about his family, the patience that never performed itself. I thought about the way he had never, in 8 months and hundreds of hours of accumulated time together, needed to be the most important thing in any room. I stood at that window and I understood, with a feeling that was close to fear, but not exactly fear, more like the feeling of standing at the edge of a very large landscape you cannot yet see the full extent of, that I might not know him as completely as I had believed. And then I thought, but I know what he does when someone he loves is diminished. I know exactly what he does. And perhaps that knowledge is the only knowledge that matters. Perhaps that is the only knowledge there ever is. The first car arrived 8 minutes later. Not a car. An SUV. Black, matte finished, belonging to a category of vehicle that has moved beyond the question of appearance entirely, that exists in a register of transport designed to communicate nothing about itself while communicating a great deal about what it is protecting. Then a second appeared behind it. Then, before the second had fully come to rest against the curb, a third. They did not arrive with noise or theatrics. They moved along that immaculate street with a smoothness that suggested the street itself had made accommodations, that the ordinary traffic of that Wednesday morning had simply organized itself into a corridor out of something that felt less like courtesy and more like instinct. By the time Daniel stepped out of the fourth vehicle, there were 10 of them arranged along the street exterior of Marshallines in a formation of such geometric precision that it communicated, without a single word or gesture, the complete vocabulary of serious and permanent authority. The men who came out around him, 12 at a minimum, positioned with the coordinated economy of people trained to protect something they regard as irreplaceable, had created, without visible instruction and without any apparent effort, a perimeter that was both absolute and, somehow, completely quiet. There was no aggression in it. There was something much more definitive than aggression. There was the settled, practiced certainty of people who have done this many times in many places and do not need to announce themselves. Giselle reached the window before anyone else. She had come with the proprietary manner of someone going to assess a minor disturbance outside her establishment, and I watched from my position by the other window as that proprietary manner left her face. It did not shift gradually. It dissolved. The way ice dissolves when placed in something much warmer than itself, suddenly, and without stages. Sophie's champagne glass left her hand. It did not shatter when it met the carpet. The carpet was too thick and too expensive for that. It simply landed and rolled away in silence, which was somehow more affecting than breaking would have been. Camille's hand rose slowly to her mouth and remained there. Ingrid had gone perfectly still in the way of someone who is very rapidly recalculating a situation and has not yet arrived at a new position. Daniel came through the doors of Marshallines, and the room became a different room. He was wearing what he always wore, dark trousers, a simple jacket, the watch. He had not changed his clothes. He had not prepared himself externally in any way that could be identified or named. The transformation was entirely internal, or rather, the thing that had always been true of him was simply no longer contained. His posture, which had always been still, was now something I did not have the right word for. It was not military posture, which is a learned and practiced straightness. It was older than military. It was the posture of someone who has never, at any point in their life, been required to make themselves smaller for another person's comfort, and who is now, in front of me for the first time, not choosing to try. He crossed the room directly to me. He looked at me the way he had always looked at me in private, with the complete and specific kindness that I had always known was the most important thing about him. And then he turned and looked at Giselle with the absolute patience of someone who has all the time there is and does not need any of it. He did not raise his voice. I want to be very specific about this because it is the detail that matters most, the detail I most want you to carry away from this particular moment. The most powerful thing I witnessed in that boutique that morning was not the motorcade, and it was not the 12 men in dark clothing, and it was not the way the room had gone so quiet you could hear the temperature of the air. It was the complete and total absence of performance in Daniel's voice when he spoke. The absence of effort, the absence of any need to impress. He said, "I understand my fiancé was directed away from the gown she wished to try. It was not framed as a question. It was a statement with the particular weight of a fact being confirmed by someone who has already verified it through other channels, and is now simply giving the other party an opportunity to respond before the next step is taken." Giselle opened her mouth. He continued in the same tone, without pausing, without varying his pace. "I also understand she was placed in the sample room, and that the quality of the experience was not consistent with the standard your establishment represents." A man had appeared at Daniel's left shoulder. I had not seen him exit any of the vehicles. He had the particular quality of presence that belongs to people who are very good at being where they are needed without calling attention to the arrival. He was tall, immaculately dressed in a way that made the suit irrelevant, in the sense that the suit was obviously not the point, carrying a leather folder with the ease of someone for whom the folder's contents represent settled matters rather than open questions. He said nothing. He held the folder and waited with the practiced patience of a person who understands that his waiting is itself a form of active pressure. Giselle said, "I can assure you there has been a misunderstanding of some kind. We would never." Daniel said, "There hasn't." 3 words. Not cold, not loud, not theatrical. The precise temperature of absolute certainty, the temperature of a thing that is simply true. He looked at me. "Which gown?" he said. I pointed to the ivory one, the architectural one, the one from the couture collection, reserved for established clients. The man with the folder produced a phone I had not seen him holding, and made a brief, quiet call that lasted perhaps 45 seconds. Giselle said, "That particular piece is subject to a selection process. There is a client list for the couture tier. There is a procedure." The man with the folder said, in a voice that had the quality of something being entered into a record, "The complete current collection, to be delivered to," and he named an address in a part of the city where addresses carry a specific and unmistakable weight, an address that Giselle recognized in the half-second it took her to hear it, because her expression changed in that half-second in a way that could not be reconstructed or recalled. She closed her mouth. She did not open it again for quite some time. Daniel walked to me and took my hand in the way he had always taken my hand, without ceremony, with complete familiarity, as though my hand were simply the place his hand went, and he said so quietly that it was only ever between the two of us, placed only in the air between my ear and his mouth. "You never have to make yourself smaller to fit anywhere, not for anyone, not in any room." I looked at the watch, the worn leather strap, the plain face. I understood fully and finally what it had always been saying. Camille recovered her composure first, which was entirely characteristic of her, composure being one of the things she had spent the past several years practicing with the diligence of someone who understands it as a professional asset. She stepped forward with a smile that had been rapidly reconstructed from its collapsed original version, a smile with visible stress at the corners, the smile of someone working against structural resistance, and said, "Daniel, what an extraordinary surprise. How wonderful that you came. We have heard so very much about you. And I have been telling the girls all morning what a lovely thing it is that you and Elena have found each other. This afternoon has been such a treat. We were just—" Daniel turned to look at her. He turned with the full, calm, entirely unhurried attention of a person who is not in any rush and who does not need to perform patience, because he has the real thing, the patience of someone who knows precisely how this conversation ends and is simply waiting, without impatience, for it to arrive at that ending by its natural path. He said, "You brought her here. It was not a question and it was not an accusation. It was the neutral statement of a fact, delivered in the tone of someone who is about to build something on that foundation." Camille said, "We wanted her to have the full experience. We thought it would be," he said, and when she was placed on the sample platform. "Were you laughing before the clips were applied, or after?" The quality of the silence that followed was different from any silence that had come before in that room. It had texture. It had mass. Camille's reconstructed smile developed a visible structural failure at the left side, a kind of subsidence, and she said, "I do not think that is quite a fair characterization of what was actually happening. It was more a matter of—" He said, "You have known her for 11 years. He did not say anything after that. He did not need to. 11 years was the entire argument, the beginning and the end of it, the statement that contained within itself every implication he intended and required no elaboration." He turned to Ingrid, who had become deeply absorbed in a point on the carpet approximately 18 inches in front of her feet, whose study of that point had the concentrated intensity of someone who has decided that the floor is the most important thing in any room. He said, "She has never said a single unkind thing about you to me. In 8 months of conversations, in hundreds of hours, not one word." Ingrid said nothing, because there was nothing available to say. No response that would not either confirm what he had said or make things measurably worse. And Ingrid was smart enough to know this, and to choose silence over the alternative. He turned to Sophie, who had retrieved her champagne glass from the carpet, and was holding it with both hands in the manner of someone seeking structural support from an available object. He said, "Your publication ran a profile of my family's philanthropic foundation approximately 18 months ago." He paused. "There were several material inaccuracies. I will have someone reach out regarding a correction." Sophie said, "A correction of what, specifically?" And the man with the leather folder said, quietly and with great precision, "Several representations regarding the scope of the Foundation's international operations and the nature of its endowment structure were incorrect." He then placed a call, brief and quiet, and Sophie's expression changed in real time as she appeared to understand that she was watching something happen to her professional relationship with a family she had just discovered she had misrepresented in print, and the color left her face in the slow, organized way that color leaves things when the blood has determined it is needed somewhere more critical, somewhere the body has decided is a higher priority than the face. What came after Marshaline's was not simple, and I will not tell you it was simple, because you deserve the honest version of this story, and the honest version includes the difficulty. The story of a powerful man entering a room and reversing the conditions inside it is one kind of story, a satisfying kind, and it has its own integrity. But it ends at the boutique door, and the rest of the story happens outside the boutique in the weeks that followed, which were harder and stranger and ultimately more revealing than any single morning could have been. 3 days after the appointment, a photograph appeared on a social media account I had never encountered. It had been taken from outside the window of Marshaline's, from the street, by someone who had been watching for the right moment. Poorly composed, but unmistakable, myself on the raised platform, the sample dress, the bulldog clips clearly visible at the back seam, presented to 16,000 followers with a caption that described me as the help attending on borrowed aspirations. The photograph spread with the specific velocity of content that has been moved intentionally, pushed into networks where it would travel, rather than content that spreads on its own organic momentum. 2 days after the photograph, an article appeared in a digital outlet that occupies the territory between tabloid and journalism, where the language of reporting is applied to the practice of insinuation. The piece described Daniel obliquely, named him by lineage without naming him by name, and characterized our relationship as a calculated romantic positioning, a nobody with ambitions, the implication ran, who had identified and pursued a target. My name was not in the piece. My face was in the photograph. The details were specific enough that everyone who knew me would make the connection, and I received, within 48 hours, a collection of messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years that were framed as concern and were in fact forms of confirmation seeking, people wanting to verify the story, to have a piece of the information. I sat with all of it for one full morning. I allowed myself exactly one morning of the grief, which was real and which was specific. The particular grief of having your life narrated by someone who has decided in advance what your story means and does not require your participation in the construction of that meaning. And then I washed my face. And I went to find Daniel, who was in his study on a call, and he looked up when I came through the door and ended the call without a word of explanation to whoever was on the other end, which told me, clearly and without ambiguity, what his priorities were in that moment. I stood in the middle of his study and I said, "I want to handle this myself." He looked at me for a long time, the look of someone making a determination about which kind of love this situation required, the love that reaches forward to protect, or the love that steps back and trusts. He said, "Tell me what you need." What I needed was a press conference, not his. Mine, not a response to the story that had been told about me, a replacement for it, a better one, told truer and told on my own terms, because the only way to displace a false narrative is to put a more true one in its space, and the truer narrative has to be better told, more vivid, more specific, more completely itself, or it will not take. This took 3 weeks to arrange properly, because the room had to be right, and the timing had to be right, and most importantly, I had to be ready, which took longer than the logistics of the rooms or the timing. The venue was the grand reception hall of the city's oldest functioning private members' club, a place of such accumulated institutional authority that its address alone is a kind of endorsement, a place whose waiting list has its own waiting list, a room that has witnessed enough of the city's genuine history that it has acquired a gravity that attaches itself to whoever stands inside it. I wore the ivory dress, the architectural couture piece from Marshaline's collection. It had been delivered to our home within 48 hours of the appointment, accompanied by the atelier's head designer, a small, precise Flemish woman named Vera, who spoke rarely but always with complete accuracy, and 3 assistants and an apology of such formal completeness that it had the texture and the weight of a legal document. Vera spent 2 full afternoons with me, fitting the gown to my exact measurements with the focused attention of someone doing something that matters to her, and at one point, while she was adjusting the placement of the structured shoulder, she said, very quietly and without looking up, that the gown had been waiting for a proportion she had been unable to articulate until she saw it standing in front of her, and that now the dress made complete sense to her, and she was grateful for the understanding. The dress fit in the way that only things that have found their correct place ever fit, as though it had been made for this body and this occasion, and no other combination of the two. I walked into the press conference and I stood at the podium and I said, "Thank you for being here. I would like to introduce myself, because introductions have been made on my behalf recently without my involvement or my consent, and the characterization that resulted was not what I would have chosen for myself. I said, my name is Elena. I am a pediatric nurse. I have been a pediatric nurse for 9 years in a ward where some of the patients are very ill and some of the days are very hard, and none of it, on any day, in any hour, has ever felt like less than a privilege. I am the daughter of 2 school teachers. I was educated on scholarships I earned. I have nothing I am ashamed of, and a great deal I am proud of, and I intend, going forward, to be very precise about which belongs in which category." I looked at the 3rd row. The representative from the outlet that had published the photograph looked at the surface of his notebook. "The photograph taken of me 3 weeks ago at a bridal boutique," I said, "was taken without my awareness or consent, and was published with a specific and unkind intent, and is entirely representative of the publication responsible for it. I have spoken with counsel. The man with the leather folder, who was seated in the front row to my left, did not look up. His presence was not a contribution to the content of what I was saying. His presence was its own statement, made simply by being there. As for the suggestion that my relationship is strategic or transactional, I met Daniel on an October evening in the rain, over a coffee I could not quite afford, and I fell in love with a man who was patient and quiet, and who paid for things without requiring acknowledgement, and who, when he left, gave me a card with only his name on it, because he was not a person who required others to be impressed by him before he was willing to be known. The fact that this man is also, as it transpires, the principal trustee of a foundation with operations across 7 countries and holdings of a scope that I am still, honestly, only beginning to fully understand. This is the least interesting thing I know about him. He remembers how I take my coffee. He walks on the traffic side of the pavement. He holds the phone away from his face when something makes him laugh, because he laughs with his whole body when he really means it. That is the person I am marrying. That. I paused for a moment. I said, "That is all I have." I stepped back from the podium. The room held its breath for a beat, and then remembered it was permitted to exhale. The article was retracted within 46 hours. The retraction came with a formal statement of such elaborate and specific regret that it read less as a correction and more as a literary performance in the genre of institutional apology, a document that named each inaccuracy by category, acknowledged each inference that had been drawn from insufficient evidence, and attributed every failure to process rather than intention, which was not credible, but was the version they could survive professionally and had therefore decided to commit to. The social media photograph was removed by the person who had posted it, an account manager at a boutique public relations firm who had, it emerged through the quiet and efficient work of the man with the leather folder, professional ties through 2 intermediate parties to Marcus's property development company, which was Camille's world, which closed the circle with a tidiness that left almost nothing to interpretation. The account manager left the firm within the week. The firm lost the 2 relevant clients shortly after. Giselle no longer works at Marshallines. I want to be clear that this was not a consequence of anything Daniel or I said, or requested, or arranged. It was the consequence of a decision made by the atelier's principal, a woman named Isabel, who was 73 years old and had built that boutique from a single workroom 4 decades earlier, with absolute clarity of vision about what it was and what it was not, and who had, once the full account of what had happened that morning reached her, made her own staffing determinations based on her own assessment of what that morning had been. Isabel came to our home personally to oversee the final fitting of the dress. She sat in our living room with a cup of tea, and the particular directness of someone who has stopped being interested in anything except the essential truth of a situation, and she told me that the gown had been made with a specific intention in mind that she had never been able to name until the fitting, and that she was pleased with the simple and complete pleasure of an artist whose work has found its correct destination, that the dress and I had found each other. Camille did not come to the wedding. She sent a gift, expensive and impersonal, chosen by someone who is primarily thinking about how the choice of gift will reflect on the chooser, rather than how it will be received by the person who opens it. And I sent her a handwritten note, thanking her for organizing the appointment at Marshaline's. Because it is the truth. She brought me there. The afternoon she designed as a diminishment was the afternoon my life assumed its final and correct shape. I would not undo it. Sophie's article about the charitable foundation was formally corrected with an editorial note appended to the original, naming each inaccuracy. I did not hear from Sophie directly. This was the correct decision on her part, and I respected it. Ingrid wrote me a letter. It was 4 pages, handwritten on plain paper, and I could feel in the handwriting itself, especially in the 3rd page where the letters become less careful and more urgent, the effort and the honesty of it, the cost of saying the true thing rather than the managed thing. Because it cost her something, I read it more than once. Because I read it more than once, I wrote back. We are not what we were to each other. We are something more honest and more careful, and I think in time we may become something better. The wedding was 30 people and a steady autumn rain, which was, of course, exactly right. The grounds of an estate that had been in Daniel's family for so many generations that the number felt geological rather than biographical, a feature of the landscape rather than a fact about a family. In the late afternoon, the light came through the old trees at the garden's edge, gold and unhurried and impossibly patient, the light of a day that knows it is being witnessed and is doing its full best. He wore the watch. I wore the dress. When he saw me come through the doors at the far end of the garden, he did something I had never, in any of our time together, seen him do in a space that contained another person. He placed his hand over his mouth. For a moment, just a moment, the length of time it takes to collect oneself, to find footing in a feeling that has arrived with more force than anticipated. Then he looked at the grass. And then he looked at me, and his eyes were saying the thing they had always been saying, from the moment under the coffee cart awning in the October rain, in every quiet evening and every market flower and every cup of coffee made with the knowledge of exactly how I take it, the thing his mouth had, in full and at last, learned to say as well. I walked toward him across the wet grass, in the dress that had been waiting for me, in the rain that had always been ours. I understood him completely. I had always understood him. That was never the question. If you have stayed with this story to its end, you already know what it is actually about, and it is not about motorcades or the couture collection or the moment a woman with engineered cheekbones is required to stop speaking. Those are the scaffolding, the decoration, the surface. The story itself is simpler and older than any of that. A woman stood on a platform in a dress that did not fit, in a room that had decided before she walked in that she did not belong there, surrounded by people who had chosen, for their own small and frightened reasons, to agree, and she did not become someone else to escape it. She did not perform a version of herself that the room might find more acceptable. She did not rage, and she did not grovel, and she did not seek the approval of any of the people in that room, because she understood, perhaps not consciously in that moment, but in the place where the true and enduring knowledge lives, that their approval had never been the thing that conferred her worth. She stood in the ill-fitting dress, and she held the truth of herself quietly, and the truth of herself was sufficient, and in the end it was the only thing that was. The cruel and the status-obsessed make a fundamental error about the nature of worth. They believe it is distributed by the room you occupy, the label attached to your coat, the address on your correspondence, the company you are keeping when people who matter are watching. This is their central and irreversible mistake. Worth is not distributed. Worth is carried. You arrive with it. It is yours before any room has the opportunity to weigh in. The lesson is older than any family's lineage, older than any boutique's reputation, older than any publication's readership. Character is the only inheritance that cannot be transferred away from you, cannot be confiscated or diminished or revised by someone else's opinion of what you are wearing. If someone in your life has placed you on that platform, has stood you up in the wrong dress and applied their judgment with a bulldog clip and stepped back to observe the results, I want you to hold on to one thing. The dress was always waiting for you. You were always the right kind of person for the right kind of life. All that was ever wrong was the room. And the room, it turns out, is temporary. The ground always shakes eventually. It has already begun. If this story reached you at the moment you needed it, share it with someone else who needs it too. Leave a comment telling me about the moment you understood that your value had never required anyone's recognition to be real. And if that moment has not yet arrived for you, if you are still standing on that platform, still in the wrong dress, still listening to the laughter, know this with everything I have. The ground beneath them is already moving. You simply cannot feel it yet. But you will.